Hi everybody, thank you for coming. It's great to see you all. I'm Susan Watkins. I'm the Director of the Centre for Culture and the Arts and a Professor in the School of Cultural Studies at Leeds Beckett University. The aim of this series of talks is to bring our research to you, the public, so that we can find out what you think and possibly how you can contribute to what we're doing. We're in alignment with the Palgrave Campaign for the Humanities, which Palgrave is a publisher which supports publications that extol the value of the humanities in our culture and wider society. And so we're working with them closely in bringing this series of talks to you. And this particular talk, I think, is really important because it coincides with Disability History Month, which runs from the 22nd of November to the 22nd of December. So we're kind of slap bang in the middle of that at the moment. And just so you know, we are filming this talk, just so that you're aware of that. So I'd like to introduce our speaker, Jessica van Horssen, who is a senior lecturer in North American history in the School of Cultural Studies and Humanities at Leeds Beckett University. Her research focuses on the history of environmental health and contamination within resource industries such as the international asbestos industry. She's published a book on this called A Town Called Asbestos: Environmental Contamination, Health and Resilience in a Resource Community, as well as several articles and chapters. One of those is about asbestos contamination in Greater Manchester. She's currently researching the history of plastics contamination and the different ways this remarkable material made its way into the daily lives of North Americans in the post-war era. And this research was inspired by Jessica's participation in the Expedition Round Britain trip this past August, in which she joined an all-female crew sailing around the UK, testing coastal waters for plastic contamination. And she also performed at Edinburgh Fringe as part of this expedition, showcasing some of the microplastics that were found on the trip to the general public. She hasn't forgotten about asbestos though, and since starting at LBU, she has begun investigating the impact of the Canadian asbestos industry on the people of Leeds. And it's that project that she's going to talk to us about today. Her title is Asbestos in Leeds, A History of Transnational Contamination. So let's welcome Jessica.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks for coming today. I'd like to begin my talk with just a short exercise, if we can, just to introduce us to the sort of thinking that I have when I start to research and write about asbestos. So if everyone could just take a deep breath in. I'd like you all to remember that your lungs absorb billions and billions of air molecules that are taken through the dusty vents in this room here today. And you can now breathe out. If you breathe in again, you can think about the membranes in your lungs, which feed into your bloodstream, filling up with air that contains, among other things, detritus from the built environment around us, including fibers, vapors, tiny airborne insects and their excrement, viruses, bacteria, and fungi. Now you can breathe out again. So on your next breath, think of the chemical fumes emanating from the petroleum-based objects in the room. These chairs are certainly not made of natural fibers. As well as the fuzz of debris, hair, and dust that is circulating just lightly through the vents in the room. Breathe out. And so what we've just done, I've taken from a classroom exercise the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency released in 1993 to teach children about the hazards of indoor air. And I think it also teaches adults about potential dangers, the potential dangers around them, as well as how their lungs work and how they are connected to their entire bodies. It demonstrates possible ways that you could be at risk just by the fact that you're sitting in this room or standing at your workstation. And I'm not trying to fearmonger at all. This room is allegedly safe. It reminds us, this exercise, not to take our environments or our bodies for granted. And it also raises interesting questions about when environments are deemed safe, like this room. Who decides what safe is? and how that decision is made. And so these are the sorts of questions that really drive my research when I'm looking into the history of the international asbestos industry. And I'd like to talk about it a bit more throughout the talk as well. So please, every time you breathe in, think about what exactly you're breathing in. So I am an environmental historian, and as such, I take fundamentally as one of my reasons for being is that place matters. It matters in history, it matters today, and it matters especially in the history of asbestos. What I'd like to discuss today is how place impacts the risk of disease, the awareness of there actually being a risk, and the possible action those who are vulnerable to risk can take. While the history of asbestos use and contamination in Leeds has some things in common with other places around the world, I hope to compare and contrast it with other sites of contamination in order to develop a place-based understanding of both risk and disease here in Leeds. I welcome your thoughts at the end of our talk because a lot of you are much better experts than I am on this specific topic, and so I would love to learn from you as well. Asbestos is a naturally occurring fiber, a fibrous mineral actually, created millions of years ago, deep within the Earth's crust. It was formed through a series of land collisions when massive chunks of land broke apart and moved and collided again, forming mountain ranges mostly. Let's see if we can have here. Particularly in the case of asbestos, we have the Appalachian mountain ranges in eastern Canada, or even the Kuruman Hills in the northern Cape of South Africa, also known as the Asbestos Mountains. I've learned that people aren't very inventive in place names while doing this research. The intense heat and friction caused by these collisions splintered the rock beneath the Earth's surface and transformed it into asbestos. You can still see these historic splinters in the mineral today, actually. And the term asbestos itself comes from the ancient Greek word for unquenchable, which really speaks to the fact that it's not easily destroyed in any way. It destroys fire, but it isn't easily destroyed in and of itself. The chemical makeup of asbestos differs slightly according to the deposit's origins and location. But they are very, very similar actually between them. We have, for example, white asbestos, and this is the type of asbestos found in places like North America and what is now Russia, and it was formed in serpentine rock, and you can see the fractured rock in the actual fibers themselves there. We have another type of asbestos that is of prime importance to Leeds. It is blue asbestos, also known as crocodilite, and it is commonly found in places like South Africa and Australia, in amphibole rock, actually. So white and blue asbestos are the two types I'm going to focus on here today, because they are the two main types of asbestos extracted and used here in Leeds. Before I get to the differences between white and blue asbestos, I would like to state that all types are dangerous. You should avoid all types. They are very carcinogenic. The individual fibers here that can be woven into cloth actually have tiny little hooks on the end of them that lodge into your soft tissues as you breathe them in and then go throughout your bloodstream from your lungs there. There has been a lot of debate about which asbestos is safe, which asbestos is the most dangerous. All asbestos is dangerous. The chemical differences between blue and white asbestos aren't extreme, with blue asbestos thought to have a slightly higher silica content, which many believed made it more dangerous. But on the other hand, white asbestos has much smaller fibers, which go into your lungs a lot easier, even when you're wearing a dust mask. And so there was a way up there. Which one were you going to choose? I'll talk about the debate over which types of asbestos were dangerous versus which were safe as we go along to demonstrate how place matters, not just when the risk of asbestos is concerned, but also in the importance of geopolitical weight when it comes to regulating its use. So asbestos was used in a variety of goods to improve their resistance to fire, rust, and decay, and it's able to withstand temperatures in excess of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is why it was so particularly suited to industry and war. with the products processed at Armley here in Leeds being a prime example of its historic use. Once considered both magical and modern because of its fireproof qualities, Charlemagne used to have an asbestos tablecloth that he dazzled guests with at parties, that he'd throw it in after a dinner and into the fire and take it back out and it would be clean, because all the food would have burned off, but the tablecloth would have remained intact. Let's blame it all on Charlemagne. So it was once considered both magical and modern because of this fireproof quality, but asbestos was quickly put into paved roads, public buildings, private homes, cement that went into the construction of bridges so that they wouldn't decay very easily, and a variety of other things, including air filters for premature babies in hospitals, dental surgery. For some reason, fire was used in dental surgery in the early 20th century, and so you would pack your mouth full of asbestos to prevent burns, and heart surgery, actually, here in Britain. It was only when the fatal health effects of the mineral became widely known that its use in daily life came to a halt, although its presence certainly remains on the landscape here in Leeds today. Canada extracted the majority of the world's asbestos in the 20th century, and politicians, city planners, and consumers in Britain saw the fireproof mineral as being crucial to creating safe, long-lasting communities. Examining the path raw Canadian asbestos took from local mine to global market can inform us of the different ways we interpret risk, blame, and the legacies of environmental contamination and justice. I've heard the streets of Armley were tinted purple because of the high use of blue asbestos in the area. And indeed, certainly Leeds was one of the prime areas in Britain that blue asbestos was used historically. How could people escape the air here in Leeds? If you're breathing in, how do you know that air is safe? When did people learn that it wasn't safe is another question that drives me. What if we were to do this breathing exercise that we started the talk with, travel back in time to 1940s Leeds? What would the air feel like as you were breathing it in? I've written a lot about the asbestos cultures of the mining communities of Canada who lived and breathed the industry on their doorsteps. They were the French-Canadian worker bees who led fairly isolated lives, disconnected from the information and resources of their American or British counterparts, largely because of language barriers. They extracted asbestos from massive open-cast mines, which offered a much higher supply of fresh air than the factories here in Leeds would have offered workers, and prevented large-scale accidents common in shaft mining like coal. So the focus was never on an asbestos disaster in a mine. They were seen as being very good and safe jobs. Foreign companies own most of Canada's asbestos mines. They supplied the wages, they supplied the housing, and they supplied the medical care, most importantly. The workers in Canada did have a union, but it was run by the Catholic Church, and your local parish priest would be the head of your union. The companies operating in Canada didn't inform their workers that asbestos was harming their health until the 1970s. And there was a real lag there with union workers just being primarily focused on saying our workers are very non-controversial, they're not going to go on strike, they're not going to make unwarranted demands. We wanted a docile working class in Canada, and that's what this region offered. One of the companies that owned mines in both Canada and South Africa was Manchester's Turner and Newell Company. It was the parent company of the J.W. Roberts factory here in Armley, and it was a real world player in terms of asbestos at the time. J.W. Roberts opened in Armley in 1874 and began textile production there using materials like cotton and hemp. As the global asbestos industry began to grow around the turn of the century, the world wars really picked up trade in asbestos because of its fireproof qualities. Roberts' operations shifted to include asbestos-containing textiles and other products. This was where the money was in the 20th century. It was no longer in cotton, and it was no longer in wool. It was asbestos. The company specialized, in making, pardon me, my goodness, insulated mattresses for steam locomotives. This is Roberts here. I don't know if many of you are from Armley or have memories of this area here. This is something that workers at the Armley factory did. They made railway mattresses for boilers and locomotives. We have a lovely picture here of the ladies laying on these mattresses, posing for the camera. It was originally one of the only factories in Britain that relied on blue asbestos, actually, which was particularly suited to this type of product because of its longer fibers. The company merged with Turner & Newell in 1920 and quickly developed new products, including sprayed limpet asbestos, which was a slurry made up of raw asbestos, cement, and water. And you can see it being sprayed in the interior of a bus here on the left, and then just in a ceiling on the right. And it was very insulating, this slurry. It was also incredibly dusty to apply. This was when operations started shifting to white asbestos, because blue asbestos isn't good for this type of product. You need smaller fibers, and that's where white asbestos comes into this discussion. It had significantly shorter fibers than blue asbestos, and even had a secondary option, which was called asbestic, which was basically the waste rock found around the asbestos fibers in the open cast mines, which companies like Turner & Newell initially disposed of in tailings piles, but then realized this doesn't burn either. We can sell it, and so they did. It was once worthless, and then it became gold. This was also when profits began to skyrocket, as this incredibly dusty work was in great demand in the 20th century, and so too were their products. There's a real post-colonial connection between the sites of asbestos extraction and the countries that had access to the best supply. Britain was a leading nation because of its historical roots in these places, Canada and South Africa specifically, as well as because of the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, which had entire factories already set up to process a large amount of fibers coming from all over the world and make them into marketable goods. The Industrial Revolution also articulated a rigid class system in which the working class, particularly of Britain's northwest, was treated with disdain by factory owners and government officials and seen by them as disposable. The legacy of this can very much be seen in 20th century Armley, and in how the risk of asbestos-related disease for this community was downplayed in the name of profit. Asbestos-related disease usually takes between 15 to 30 years to develop, depending on your level of exposure, and experts are still uncertain of the volume to longevity ratio required to cause disease. Although Britain had no domestic asbestos mines, the first recorded death from asbestos-related disease was here. It was in 1927, and a textile worker in the northwest of England. This first death was subject to an inquest, but no action against the resource or the industry followed this inquest. The show must go on. However, things started getting more complicated as more people began to die. The first person whose family successfully sued an asbestos company for compensation for the wrongful death of their loved one was Nellie Kershaw, who was a factory worker for Turner & Newell in Rochdale, just outside of Manchester. She died in 1924. She had worked as a spinner for Turner & Newell for 15 years, by the time of her death. And when she died, Dr. W.E. Cook discovered that her lungs were hardened beyond the ability to function due to being packed full of asbestos fibers. 2 years later, American asbestos giant, the Johns Manville Company, faced its first claim for compensation from textile workers in New Jersey. And that same year, Cook coined the term asbestosis to describe this disease. And this obviously is not the clearest of X-ray images, but this was what they were working with. This is an X-ray of asbestosis here. You can see the fibers in the lung cavity building up until the lungs no longer function. So asbestosis was the first disease ever to be associated with asbestos, and factory workers, including those who beat railway mattresses here in Armley, or sprayed asbestos slurry for that matter, were particularly vulnerable to this type of disease because of the intensity of their asbestos exposure. It was hard to see at J.W. Roberts' factory when you were working. The air was so filled with fiber. Processing the mineral breaks up asbestos fibers, and poor ventilation technology keeps these fibers floating in the factory air. What results from this is asbestosis, or the hardening of the fluid lining of your lungs beyond their ability to function. It takes a while to develop, it takes years, but once it does, death is very painful and also drawn out. It's a horrific death, and you can die of suffocation, you can die of heart failure due to lack of oxygen. It is not a good disease, obviously. Asbestosis, however, resembled another industrial disease that workers in Britain's northwest were already familiar with, byssinosis. And so I can do a little flip. This is caused by asbestos, this is caused by cotton or wool. And so while cotton and wool do not have the carcinogenic properties of asbestos, this sort of clogging up of the fluid lining of the lungs is something that people in this region were familiar with by the time people started dying of asbestosis. Especially common in the textile factories located in and around Manchester and Leeds, byssinosis happens with cotton or wool. And so, before Cook coined the term, deaths like Kershaw's in 1924 could have been attributed to exposure to cotton fibers rather than asbestos fibers. It was very easily confused. By the comparison, by the 1920s, Canadian asbestos miners had no idea about the state of their bodies, nor did they have any legal recourse if and when they did have information about it. Asbestos-related disease was not eligible for compensation, workers' compensation in Canada. And once it became eligible, the companies quickly lobbied to have it taken off the books. While asbestosis grew to be particularly common here in Britain, only a fraction of Canadian asbestos miners apparently contracted this disease. They weren't even unionized by the time of Kershaw's death. The people investigating their health were paid by company officials. And so when I say the rates of asbestosis in Canada were fairly low, it's because the companies wanted us to see that they were low. The information that we're working with here is very much tainted by corporate crime. However, when we talk about the medical communities in Canada practicing medicine on asbestos workers there, they did have evidence of a lot of asbestosis. They just didn't tell the workers. And when workers died, they didn't tell their families that that is what they died of. There weren't any public inquiries into their deaths, and they willfully lied to government officials inspecting the works. And this is a quote here from Dr. Kenneth Smith, who worked at one of the major asbestos mines in Canada in the 1940s. And this brings up an important point. Much of the history of asbestos, as we know, is rooted in the history of corrupt corporations hell-bent on maximizing profits while workers suffer. Constructing this story of transnational contamination takes a mixture of medical journals, factory reports, and confidential company memos that were able to be obtained before the companies destroyed them. We don't know when the first death due to asbestos exposure happened in Canada. There is no record of this death, or indeed in any of the other places around the world where the mineral was actually mined. South Africa, we don't know the first death there either. However, that is why Britain is actually very important to this story, because there were records kept, there were public inquiries, and that is incredibly important here. So, while Cook's discovery of asbestosis made both local and national news here in Britain, it was reported in the newspapers as well as medical journals like The Lancet. It was seen as simply yet another industrial disease the working class was vulnerable to, not the general public. And this is a really important distinction here. It's when the general public became at risk that people started to legislate. It wasn't while workers were getting ill. Many believed that dust was simply a fact of life for factory workers, and that there was no need to change that fact. It's just how it was. If you wanted a job in this region, you had to accept a level of dust in the factory. Throughout this period, reporting on dust exposure and disease was very common practice in the British press, especially in the local newspapers of the northwest of England. Knowledge about the risk to workers' health was public, but action to prevent it was incredibly slow. An example of this can be seen in 1928 in Leeds. The Manchester Guardian, the Leeds Mercury, and the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, among other major papers, all reported on the death of Margaret Marsden at age 34 in August 1928. Marsden had worked for J.W. Roberts in Armley for a number of years, and only a year after Cook coined the phrase asbestosis, the Leeds coroner described Marsden's death as being caused by asbestos poisoning, or also a fibrosis, which is consistent with asbestosis, although he didn't use the word. It was also noted in the newspaper that this was the second death in Leeds due to asbestos exposure in a matter of weeks. This was coming quick and fast here. And yet, it was reported in the paper, and that was it seemed. Asbestos contamination was a significant problem in Leeds, and aside from reports in newspapers across the country about Marsden's death, as with Kershaw's death just a few years earlier, there seemed to be very few attempts to stop the deaths from happening. While awareness of the looming crisis didn't inspire any discussion about an asbestos ban, it did allow for a slow process of regulating the levels of dust workers were exposed to in factory air. It really wasn't until asbestos-related disease became prominent in non-working class people that Britain really began to consider import bans and the removal of the mineral from public spaces. The death toll due to asbestos-related disease kept rising in Britain in the interwar period, with workers in places like Leeds, Manchester, and Glasgow being most affected. Again, in 1934, another resident of Armley was reported to have died due to asbestos exposure. Arthur Dobson is a really interesting case. He lived on Avery Road in Armley, and he died at the age of 63 after unknowingly suffering from a 20-year-old disease. Dobson had never worked for J.W. Roberts. This is one of the first examples we have of a non-asbestos worker dying of an asbestos-related disease. It is an incredibly important moment in this history. While Dobson didn't work for J.W. Roberts, every day he walked through the Roberts site on his way. He was a cashier in a local shop in Armley, and he walked through the site, and that was enough to give him enough exposure to have asbestos poisoning kill him. And so what this really does is illustrate how pervasive asbestos was in the air in Armley at this time. And you could not escape it, even if you were at home, even if you were somewhere else in the neighborhood. So his death, Dobson's death, is incredibly significant. However, it's significant to us here today. It wasn't all that significant to people in 1934, Armley, actually. The industry remained buoyant in Britain, and nobody seemed particularly inclined to change that, especially as another war with Europe was on the horizon, because asbestos was so integral to the war machine. Although it didn't go far enough, this kind of attention, the newspaper attention to asbestos, was almost non-existent in Canada, with the first newspaper article on asbestosis only appearing in 1949, and that wasn't even to report on a death. There were articles in Canadian medical journals prior to this, but the French-Canadian asbestos workers didn't have access to medical journals, and they were largely funded and edited by the British and American companies who owned the mines themselves. Well, I know that the legacy of asbestos in Armley is quite focused on blue asbestos in many cases, especially because it turned the streets so visibly blue. One of the reasons I keep going back to the Canadian example is because the history of asbestos in Armley and Leeds more generally definitely involves Canada and the false sense of health attributed to the miners who worked there. Turner and Newell and Bell's Asbestos were two of the British companies that owned asbestos mines in Canada, but so too did American companies, such as the powerful Johns Manville Company, which I've mentioned earlier. Johns Manville was the leading asbestos goods manufacturer in the world for much of the 20th century, and it was a real heavyweight in the industry. When death after death was reported in places like Leeds in the 20s and 30s, a boardroom decision had to be made about the future of the industry before government regulators finally decided to act. Unlike Turner and Newell, Johns Manville didn't operate mines in Africa. It wasn't tied to blue asbestos. Instead, all of its operations were dependent on white Canadian asbestos, which was worth less than blue in international markets in the interwar period, and they really wanted this to change. Because of this, Johns Manville began a campaign against those who were starting to talk about the health risks the mineral posed, supported allegedly by science. And I say allegedly, and we'll go into this later on. They used the seemingly healthy bodies of Canadian asbestos workers as evidence that white asbestos was safe. The deaths here in Leeds were because of blue asbestos, not because of white. And it was a real trick that this company played, and that all of the other companies played along with, actually, to keep the industry afloat in one way or another. In a May 1938 address at an international meeting of asbestos producers, Dr. R.H. Stevenson defended the health record of the Canadian industry and insisted that it was only African blue asbestos that caused disease because of its high silica content, absent in Canadian white asbestos. Stevenson stated that asbestosis was a rare case amongst asbestos workers in Canada, although forgot to mention the increasing rates of American asbestos workers suing companies like Johns Manville because of their exposure to white asbestos. He also forgot to mention that Johns Manville was paying his salary. Stevenson said that he had been studying asbestos in Canada for 10 years, and we have been highly pleased to note that the extreme rarity of asbestosis among our men. He then recommended simply rotating employees every 10 years, from dusty areas to less dusty ones, to give the lungs a break and time to clean out. Because the asbestos-related deaths of British factory workers could not be ignored, Johns Manville had company doctors claim that it was African blue asbestos that was causing these deaths, not white asbestos, and Canadian miners were their evidence. Canadian asbestos apparently was the one you should trust. Despite Stevenson's claims, many asbestos producers still had doubts about the apparent safety of white asbestos over blue. C.S. Bell, a lawyer for Turner and Newell, forwarded a transcript of Stevenson's speech to Sir Samuel Turner, president of the company. A note from Bell included with the speech stated that while Stevenson appeared to consider that blue asbestos is more liable to promote asbestosis than Canadian, by reason of the higher proportion of silica, as far as I can trace from the published analysis, the silica content of Canadian fiber is almost identical, i.e. about 40%. And another Turner and Newell executive, F. Busey, critiqued Stevenson's conclusions like this. Dr. Stevenson has obviously had little experience of post-mortem examinations, and we shall therefore have to be guided more by men who have the opportunity of many such examinations. I cannot but feel that their experience of known cases, if our medical board were to examine the 507 men mentioned, there would be more cases to report. And this is really interesting because I see this correspondence as acknowledging that Canadian asbestos is just as dangerous as African asbestos, but that they were unwilling to do anything about it. That let's just keep this between us. And Stevenson was a bit of a hack, to be fair. He did have access to X-ray machines, but his test for whether you had asbestosis or not was if you could stand up and down in your chair 25 times under a minute. If you could, you were fine. So that was his scientific methodology. Experience dealing with health problems in British factories trumped Stevenson's convictions, but Turner and Newell officials did not publicly refute his claims, and in fact started to shift their reliance on blue asbestos to white. The unwillingness of company officials to challenge Stevenson's assertions about Canadian asbestos being safe quickly became a much relied upon mantra, actually, in defense of white asbestos and in defense of their own profits. Indeed, for every public inquiry into an asbestos-related death that appeared in a British newspaper, there were dozens of ads in those same newspapers for asbestos sheds, asbestos tiles, asbestos paint, asbestos insulation, and even asbestos clothing. Early 20th century newspaper advertisements from the northwest of England spoke about asbestos being particularly suited to the people of this region. One ad, published at roughly the same time as Nellie Kershaw's death in 1924, claimed that the large number of misbehaving children in Lancashire and Yorkshire could be calmed down by wearing clothing made of Bell's asbestos cloth to put out their fire. Another tongue-in-cheek ad claimed that the early 20th century northern man was actually fortunate if he lived in a house made of asbestos, because when he came home filled with fire, alcohol, the home itself would just calm him down and put that fire out so he could be a good husband, father, and breadwinner. Of course, Canadian asbestos was particularly easy to pack into rolls of insulation used in these homes, the paint that coated these homes' walls, and the shingles that lined the roofs as well. I think the World Wars contributed to this complacent attitude for fireproof products and the British public's appetite for fireproof materials. Anyone who experienced, first I'll show you, here's some examples of asbestos cloth from Bell, which owned a mine in Canada. Anyone who lived through something like this, the Manchester Blitz, this building, I know from a colleague, was also bombed during the Second World War. Any sort of air raid in a local community would give that local community an appreciation for fireproof buildings. It's very understandable why the thirst for asbestos-based goods was so strong in Britain, in Europe as well. Anyone who served on the front during the World Wars would know that their uniforms were also made of asbestos cloth. In case they went under heavy fire, they would not burn to death. They would likely die of other causes. Furthermore, it was a lot quicker to get raw asbestos shipments from Canada than it was to get them from South Africa during the war. And so all of a sudden, the Canadian industry eked out the South African due to a lot of really interesting circumstance. The British government was unwilling to compromise the apparent safety of the public because of a suspected risk in factories. Nobody thought asbestos could be dangerous once it left those factory walls. Instead, they believed the factory was the problem, not the fiber. During the Second World War, asbestos companies continued to obscure medical evidence and pitch the asbestos debate about being Canada versus Africa, safe versus white. And there was definitely racist undertones to this process as well. Canada was the Boy Scout. Everyone loves Canada. They're safe, they're friendly, they're nice. South Africa, it was far away, it was threatening, and most importantly, South African asbestos wasn't white. This became even more apparent once the Cold War began and Soviet asbestos, which was the same type of asbestos as mined in Canada, was tainted communist red. And so it was very much this geopolitical marketing turn that Canada fully participated in order to give their industry the advantage. Indeed, following the Second World War, the introduction of the Housing Temporary Accommodation Act of 1944, Britain ordered 100,000 prefabricated homes from places like Canada to be delivered to urban centers around the country that had been bombed during the war. They wanted to rehouse their citizens in safe and modern homes, and asbestos needed to be in those homes to make them safe and modern. This took asbestos exposure outside the factory walls and into British homes, actually. Even though there was a general awareness about the health risks of the mineral in Britain by this time, the need for new fireproof, durable homes was too great to say no to this kind of product. While these prefabricated houses were purchased under the Temporary Homes Program, many of the small asbestos bungalows remain on Britain's urban landscape today. And as we see here in this picture that was taken a few years ago, people are still living there. This is a war veteran living in his asbestos bungalow, which he would have gotten partly as a reward for his service. As far as the British government was concerned, the general public was safe, housed in structures that had indoor plumbing, electricity, and state-of-the-art insulation. These homes offered modernity to an urban working class in particular that were previously stuck in city center slums. And so the home was another site of contamination within the international asbestos industry. It took much longer for awareness of this contamination to develop, as it took longer for the disease this sort of slow exposure caused to develop as well. Prior to this understanding, and despite rising disease rates in factory workers, Britain could not get enough of asbestos at the midpoint in the 20th century. This had such a strong effect on the type of asbestos in Britain that even with more reports of workers in Armley or Manchester dying due to asbestos exposure, it was always blue asbestos the industry blamed, not white. This was the problem. White was the solution. By the end of the Second World War, British medical professionals began to challenge reports stating that white asbestos was relatively safe by revealing that 80% of the asbestos used in England at this time was actually white Canadian asbestos, and workers were still dying. This included, of course, asbestos used at J.W. Roberts and Armley, but still, companies like Johns Manville maintained the argument for decades, and the Canadian government took it up as well, while the mineral, which was worth more than gold by the time of the Second World War in international markets, brought in huge amounts of profits to corporations, to government officials, and to nobody else. So forceful was the company's insistence that Canadian asbestos was harmless, that it permeated the communities where asbestos was a real part of the local community, and convinced government officials that there was simply a solution to the asbestos problem, and that solution was buy Canadian. Of course, this was nonsense. White asbestos is just as deadly as blue asbestos, and many of the asbestos-related deaths that occurred in Leeds, and will continue to occur in Leeds due to the delay between exposure and fatality, can be attributed to white Canadian asbestos. Just at the end of the war, as reconstruction efforts began to pick up in Britain, a secret laboratory near Lake Placid, New York, accidentally, as they called it, discovered that white asbestos caused cancer. Blue asbestos causes cancer too, but they didn't really know this until around 1943, this discovery here in particular. And this accidental discovery was quickly hushed, of course. It was made through the secret autopsy of the lungs of dead Canadian asbestos workers, which were then put into the boot of Johns Manville's lawyer's car and driven across the Canada-US border to the lab near Lake Placid, so they could be examined next to the lungs of lab mice as well to compare the levels of exposure. They weren't looking for cancer, but they did find it. This firmly disproved the claim that white asbestos was safe, and the Johns Manville Company, which funded the study, kept the findings private so profits wouldn't be adversely affected. Asbestosis as a medical term is fairly abstract for the general public. You don't really know what it means. It has something to do with asbestos, but cancer is something everyone understands. It is fatal, so is asbestosis, but that link is right there with cancer. They couldn't let this news get out. Both Johns Manville and Turner and Newell wanted to avoid any association between asbestos and cancer if they could. The people of Armley, through various oral history projects, have helped construct a picture of what life was like in the area while J.W. Roberts was producing asbestos-based goods. Apparently the windows needed dusting every hour. It looked like snow had just fallen on the ground, so that children actually made snowballs and threw them at each other. Snowballs made of asbestos. There was also an asbestos-based artificial snow if you wanted a snowy scene in your house at Christmas. You could sprinkle asbestos flakes around your home. The familiarity with the mineral from the people in Armley is actually very similar to the familiarity of the people of asbestos mining communities in Canada at this time as well. And young people in these communities today still have a strange affinity with the mineral. And this is an image of a teenager from one of the asbestos mining towns in Canada doing a snow angel in an asbestos tailings pile. Even though J.W. Roberts closed operations in Armley in 1959, its legacy remains in Leeds today, as we well know. What happened here is a real indication of the freedom of multinational corporations when they exploit local communities. and the failures of the medical community and the politicians to prevent it. Profit was key above all else, and so was employment. These people had jobs, that's what they needed. They didn't need medical attention. They didn't need legislation interrupting their progress in the job. What happened here is a real testimony as well to the way that communities can form an identity around a crisis. And it's really interesting, and I do hope to learn more about what happened in Armley over the last 100 years. Considering J.W. Roberts stopped operations in 1959 in Armley, it's startling to know there remains a significant amount of raw asbestos in the local environment still from these factory efforts. In 1978, members of Leeds City Council informed Turner Renewal officials of the continued asbestos problem in Armley due to poor cleanup efforts once Roberts left the area 20 years before. All it would take was a quick blast of wind and that fiber would be airborne, going into the lungs and homes of local people. The company contributed £15,000 towards the cleanup of the site on the condition that Leeds City Council would not inform the public of the risk. Council agreed. They took the money and they agreed. Turner Renewal also ensured that any mention of the factory site and its use of asbestos on that site would be removed from local land registry records, which also happened. It was around this time that rates of mesothelioma began to rise in the region. Mesothelioma is a fast-acting, very aggressive cancer affecting the lining of major organs, and its only cause is asbestos. Mesothelioma isn't caused by anything else, and that's why it was often seen as a very rare and random cancer. The rates here in Britain are very high for mesothelioma, and around 4,000 people, I believe, still die each year. Mesothelioma typically develops after 20 to 30 years of low exposure to the fiber, so that when regulations came into these factories to lower the amount of dust in the air, fibers were still getting in your lungs, but then asbestosis wouldn't kill you because your lungs wouldn't be filled with asbestos fibers. The cancer would kill you instead. So you had a choice, or you actually didn't. Because of the deception of company doctors in the 1940s, awareness of asbestos being carcinogenic was only really coming to light in the 1960s and 70s, with a British doctor here in the Northwest actually discovering that asbestos causes breast and ovarian cancer in women, where it causes lung cancer and cancers of other major organs in men. So women's bodies were affected differently, it seems, than male bodies when it comes to asbestos exposure. And that is something that people didn't want to hear. Women were particularly vulnerable to these diseases because they worked as the weavers in these factories, which were incredibly dusty professions. We didn't want women to be getting sick. Women were. We just wouldn't talk about it. That was the balance that they worked out. The rising incidences of mesothelioma in Leeds started raising the profile of the continued issue of contamination in Armley. In 1987, John Battle, MP for Leeds West, joined Leeds City Council in calling for an inquiry into this issue once the Yorkshire Evening Post began looking into the Armley deaths. However, of course, during this time, the Thatcher government decided to do such a thing would cause needless concern and stated that nobody was to know the harm the dust would cause to those living in this area. Please remember that the concern wasn't needless. The first person we know to have died of asbestos-related disease was in Britain in 1907. There is medical evidence of this, and it was reported in the papers. The next person to die, 1924, Manchester. Also medical evidence, also in the papers. Here in Leeds, 1928, at least 2 deaths. Also have medical evidence of this. It was also reported in the papers. I can go on, of course. But not only were companies well aware of the risk prior to the mesothelioma cases of the 70s and 80s and today, but so too was Leeds City Council, so too was the national government, and so too were factory inspectors and medical professionals. How many people needed to die before the government's concern was warranted? Or perhaps more accurately, which type of person needed to die before these agencies became motivated to make any sort of changes? This was a dangerous material, but the people it was affecting and continues to affect were not worth the time of regulators. And the misdirection by companies invested in the Canadian industry was all too easy to believe. Britain banned imports of blue asbestos in 1986, but continued to purchase and use white asbestos to 1999. And indeed, Canada only stopped selling its asbestos, I believe 2 years ago, when we had a government change. Leeds City Council eventually took action on the issue and started inspecting the homes of Armley, quantifying the problem by measuring the amount of dust still present in this neighborhood. In one of the surveys taken between 1998 and 2001, 363 out of 364 homes inspected next to Midland Works were found to be contaminated by asbestos at unsafe levels. Remember that 1959 was when asbestos operations stopped in this area. By 2008, they had added another 610 homes to this list, meaning that almost all of the homes in Armley were still contaminated after almost 50 years since J.W. Roberts left. Asbestos is not something that goes away easily, and it's an extremely costly process to decontaminate these sites. When asked for help by Leeds City Council, the British government in the early 2000s again refused. They said it wouldn't be a good use to public funds to clean up Armley. Because of the policy of deceit and denial asbestos companies like Turner and Newell practiced over the last century, there remains uncertainty regarding what type of asbestos is dangerous, all types, what could be a site of contamination anywhere, and how one gets exposed to the mineral, a multitude of different ways. It could just be walking through a site. Because of this, the overarching cultural narrative around the asbestos industry is one of betrayal. It is a quintessential industry that people bring up when we talk about corrupt corporations. The chronicity of asbestos-related disease, the feeling of being unsafe not only at work but also at home or simply by breathing the air, is a toxic legacy of asbestos that only continues today. And what I don't know today is what it feels like to take deep breaths in Armley. And so I will end it there, and if you have any questions or thoughts, I welcome them very much. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sure there are some comments and questions. It's a fascinating, well, disturbing paper, I think, because it's really got a legacy. Anyone like to say anything? Oh, lots of hands. Yeah.
I actually work for Leeds City Council. To me, you painted rather a black and bleak picture of Leeds City Council and sort of infer that they're not actually doing enough to sort out asbestos in the area. Are you aware that Leeds City Council spent hundreds of thousands of pounds clearing houses out of the areas over a period of time, and that they've got all the houses recorded, and if anybody who's moved into areas, and we still get inquiries from people that asbestos is well cleared. Are you aware of that?
I am aware of Leeds City Council's efforts.
That did come across, I'm afraid.
My apologies for that. I think my point was that historically speaking, Leeds City Council hasn't been this motivated, and that is a problem. And that delay can lead to more incidences of disease.
Well, I actually used to manage Leeds City Council's asbestos unit, and I've managed it for 9-12 years. I can assure you, and I can assure the audience here, that Leeds City Council have a very, very good asbestos policy on surveying all the properties, managing all the asbestos in the properties, and doing the works that are necessary to remove asbestos from the properties, if it's classed as dangerous. Because obviously under regulation for control of asbestos regulations, there's a duty to manage asbestos. And that was brought in because many, many years ago, in the 70s, 80s and 90s, which you referred to, people said, they've got asbestos, the first reaction was, let's remove it. The HSC, the Health and Safety Executive, I think, the reason why they brought the control of asbestos regs in 2002, identified it was a greater risk to remove it rather than to manage it if it was in a good condition. Hence the reason why they introduced regulation 4.
Mm-hmm. And I do know, and this Leeds City Council isn't unique in that sort of policy, and I do know that removing asbestos does create a lot of unnecessary dust. But to tell people who live in these homes not to hammer a nail into their wall is impractical. And some of the advice that I've seen city councils give local residents of how to manage the asbestos in their homes is not satisfactory in any way.
The problem at the moment is that domestic properties are outside that regulation. That's the problem at the moment. That's a health and safety issue, and obviously the central government decision. To me, and to an awful lot of people in Leeds, we are of the opinion that asbestos within housing should be brought into those regulations. And we're trying to fight for that, and unfortunately we're getting into the wall. But that should happen, hopefully sooner rather than later.
Well, I think we can all agree on that, absolutely. Yes, there was a hand over this side.
Yeah, I was just going to come back on that point because I read the original Medical Officer of Health's report, which was precipitated by John Battle's intervention over the rising asbestos deaths in Armley. And what that report showed was that the incidence of deaths were quite widely spread across the Armley area. And when it came to the time that the Leeds City Council eventually decided to act on the issue, they addressed the issue of contamination and subsequent removal of asbestos in only part of the Armley area. So after considering this tragedy for some time, I came to the conclusion that there were still issues today in areas where deaths had occurred, but surveys were never carried out and contamination probably still exists. But because of the restrictions that Leeds City Council put on their surveys, we'll never know to the extent that this problem still exists.
Yes.
I had a question regarding the fire retardant properties of asbestos. Has anyone ever weighed up the total death toll of asbestosis, mesothelioma and so on, compared to possibly the benefits of historically having a fire retardant?
Yeah, there's quite a, it's
Do
quite
you know
a
of any correlation between the two?
delicate debate. I know when 9/11 happened, a historian of asbestos wrote a book that began if both towers had had asbestos in it, the people who died that day would not have died such horrible deaths. And to say that people die of disease does not equate to the amount of people who die of fire. And so that was a very controversial argument. It's not necessarily one that I support in any way. And she's no longer a practicing historian. But I have not done that way up because it's hard to quantify what type of death is worthwhile having. I personally think humans weren't meant to be fireproof. And any effort to make humans fireproof will come at a level of risk. It's certainly the synthetic products that have been developed since asbestos has stopped being used to create firefighters' uniforms, for example, they are also toxic. This is not a safe thing to say, oh, we're going to be fireproof, we'll all be safe and happy. You might be for 20 years, but it is that risk, of course. And so I don't have a firm answer to your question, but it is something that is discussed, the benefit versus the risk.
Okay. Yes, Eric.
Thank you very much for an insightful talk. I just wanted to ask about, you sort of mentioned that the ways in which the public and official responses to asbestos, it has to do with who was suffering from its presence. And you mentioned that, I think, mostly in terms of class. But I wanted to also mention gender, and people noticing that women were affected differently to male bodies. Do you think that the gender element as well, and that different people, men and women, were getting affected by this disease, that has something to do with waking the public and official consciousness?
I do, actually. And there are a lot of more recent newspaper reports of people all of a sudden developing asbestos-related disease, but they had had exposure as children. Their fathers had worked in a mine, or their mothers had worked in a factory and came home and hugged them after work, and that was enough. And it is that childhood exposure that has been publicized over the last maybe 15, 20 years that has really shook people, saying it wasn't just workers who acknowledged a risk when they went to work every day. It is innocent children as well being affected. I do think there is definitely a gendered element there as well. I know in the Canadian asbestos communities, the miners were the ones who were inspected. There were women working there as well, in the more dusty areas, in factories. They weren't inspected. And once in 1944 they were, and they were just, the summary of that inspection was, women get sick a lot. Women are tired. Working full-time is hard for women. That's why they have medical issues. It's not asbestos, it's women. And then in 1977, medical officials were challenged in Canada for not looking into the female factory workers there. And they again said, it's not our problem. They don't work in this industry long enough to have any sort of disease. It would be a waste of our resources to look into it. And so there is a real gendered aspect there. There's another aspect of race as well. The asbestos miners in places like South Africa are in a incredibly worse condition than Canadian asbestos mining communities are now. And those are still very toxic sites along the hills in South Africa. And so I think asbestos can really tell us about which type of person our world values.
Yes.
What part did the unions play in this history which you've encountered? Were they as ignorant as the rest of the public, or were they more concerned with jobs for the workers, or just?
My reading of the union role was that they were ignorant for quite a bit of this history, but once they started learning about the incidences of disease, they were primarily concerned with employability. What were these people to do if they weren't going to work in this factory or this mine? And that was seen as something that was a major concern for union officials. They needed to keep their workers at work. And so unions were very much lobbying for the reduction of dust in the air in these places of work to make their workers safe, not realizing at the time that even a small amount of dust can cause cancer. And so it was sort of that sort of confusion, confliction that was happening in the union movement.
Okay, well, I'm sure Jessica will be happy to speak to anyone individually after the talk. Thank you very much for coming. Let's give her another clap.